Now, following on, we'll keep the international perspective going. This session now will look at the global auction for jobs and its consequences for decades. The idea that more education would lead to greater individual and national prosperity has been a cornerstone of developed economies, that university degrees give Americans, Europeans and Australasians a competitive advantage in the global knowledge wars. This next presentation challenges that conventional wisdom, and we had a taste of it yesterday. Professor Hugh Lauder, a co-author of The Global Auction, a milestone book based on an intellectual study using original data collected over several years from 7 major developed and developing countries. Hugh Lauder is based at the University of Bath in the UK, where he's Professor of Education and Political Economy. Would you please give him a warm welcome again?
Thanks, Kerry. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great privilege for me to be here today, and particularly in the light of the discussion and the debate yesterday. Before I go on, I should just pay my respects to the traditional owners of this land and elders past and present. It's a very similar kind of greeting that you would give in New Zealand and with respect to Maori. So, first of all, let me just say what I think is the good news, and then I'm going to talk euphemistically about the challenges, because I'm not sure that the challenges are ones that we can necessarily overcome, but I shall try. And I shall point you in a hopeful direction towards the end. So in order to tell you about the good news, I think this conference is the good news. I think the questions that have been set by these two agencies and the agenda that they're setting through this is really getting to the heart of many of the key issues that are now confronting developed economies from the Western, let us call it that, world. And I haven't seen in other countries like the United States or the UK this set of challenging questions that were raised yesterday. So I think that if you've got that kind of awareness of the issues that you're confronting, then that is a real step forward. The alternative, of course, is to simply be in denial or simply not know what to do or how to respond. And that, I have to say, is my experience of some governments in the Western European world, although the EU itself is beginning to get to grips with some of this now. So that, I think, is the good news. What are the challenges then? Let's call it challenges for the moment. In order to talk about the challenges, I want to now move to my adopted hometown of Bath. And in Bath, there is an abbey. It's a very old abbey. It was first, well, the first King of England was crowned there. And if you go to the front doors of that abbey, big doors, there are 2 ladders on either side. And up these ladders are climbing angels. And this is Jacob's ladder, and they're going to heaven. Only some of them are falling down the ladder. And these, of course, are the sinners that are not going to go to heaven. And if you will, the rhetoric of the knowledge economy is precisely that. It's the credential ladder that you climb. And the promise of that rhetoric of the knowledge economy that policymakers around the world have opened for young people is that if you climb that credential ladder, you will get a well-paid, rewarding, creative job. And I think that rhetoric is now exhausted. And it's very clear from the discussions that we're having yesterday that many of the things that I'm going to be talking about in the next 20 minutes or so are ones that you've already clocked onto in ways that perhaps in the United Kingdom and the United States they haven't quite got there yet. So what is the fundamental issue or problem with this idea of the knowledge economy? Well, first of all, let's just have a look at why it's such a beguiling idea, why it's such a beguiling ideology. And it's a beguiling ideology because it seems like it's a win-win situation for the globe. And it's a win-win situation because what it's saying is that everyone, if they've got the opportunity to take advantage of an education who does so, can get a rewarding job. But there's a twist. And in the 90s, particularly American writers like Robert Reich, who's a superb writer, but got it just wrong in the Work of Nations, what he said was that, look, there's a win-win for West and East here. The West will do the brain work, and the West will do the brain work because of its superior universities. And I notice that Australia has got a series of universities now in the top 100, very impressive, if you believe that stuff. You shouldn't. And there's more to come if I get time to talk about PISA and the OECD. So there's the brain work and the innovation systems will come out of the West, but the East Asian countries will be pulled into the global economy because that's where the body work will be done. That's where the body work will be done. And that was a comfortable kind of assumption that policymakers operated with throughout the 90s and close to the mid-2000s and beyond. And there was another interesting twist to this story, and that was that it was also a way of improving social justice. Because as long as you had open education systems where those with the motivation to improve, to develop their learning, if they could climb that ladder from wherever they came in terms of their social background, then you would also see improved equality of opportunity. So this was a beguiling rhetoric, and it was one that policymakers still love and still repeat because of precisely it is so attractive. But it ain't necessarily so. And I want to talk now about the global auction for jobs. And the jobs I'm talking about now are not the ones that American economists and British economists assumed for so long would be the ones which would be offshored, which is the low-skilled jobs. I'm talking about high-skilled jobs. So this global auction is a Dutch auction, by and large. And a Dutch auction is a reverse auction. And the best way of explaining that is there's a German website, and on the German website, jobs are offered to those who are the lowest bidders for those jobs. That's a Dutch auction. And what I want to suggest is that there are some winners that operate within a normal, if you will, Sotheby's type auction. That's what we expect. But for the majority of workers, including graduates, we're now into a Dutch auction. Well, the question then is why? What's going on? What's changed in the world for this to happen? Well, the first thing, what has been referred to this morning already and was referred to yesterday, is the massive growth of higher education in East Asia. I was in New York at the World Bank not so long ago talking to a Chinese policymaker, and we said, very impressive the way you're developing your capacity to educate people in higher education. He said, yeah, it's going to be more impressive. I said, how so? He said, well, our plan now is to have 195 million graduates by 2020. Can you imagine the capacity of the ambition of that just on its own? So, of course, they're not all going to be high quality because we know that there are problems in China. One of the critics of our book said, China has no bench, this is an American, and that means that you don't have the reserve capacity from universities. And my response was, America has no bench either. Once you get beyond the Ivy League and the top state universities there, the editor accepted that, so it's controversial, but anyway. So, I said to this guy, what are you going to do with 195 million graduates? And he said, we're going to put them in the service sector. And for reasons that I'm going to talk about in a minute, you can see that that ain't going to work. That just isn't viable in terms of their aspirations, because large swathes of the service sector are low skill and increasingly being automated, even in terms of the kind of brain power that we normally expected to be applied to jobs. So then I go to Peking, and I'm talking, or Beijing, and I'm talking there to a very, very senior higher education policymaker. And I said, what are you going to do with all these graduates? And he said, put them in the army. In the end, it may well be they need 195 million graduates. Can you imagine that? That's about 3 and a bit times the size of the population of Britain. But there will be tensions in that process. And you can see it working out even now in China and places. So that's the first trend. It's the fact that they're now producing enough graduates of a high enough quality to service, for example, the multinational companies. The second trend is what we call a quality price revolution. And the quality price revolution hits at and strikes at precisely that claim of Robert Reich's and others that all the premiums would be earned in the West because of the brain power. And what you see is that that is now changing very rapidly indeed. So it's quite clear that in China and in India, depending on which sectors you're talking about, you're now seeing high-quality goods being produced at cut price by Western standards. And there are different aspects to this which are of quite important significance. The first one is, one of the things that we always assumed, this is Phil Brown, my co-author, and myself, was that you needed a very strong social infrastructure to create the skills to produce high-quality goods. And we had in our mind the paradigm case of Germany. Well, what we discovered was, as one executive of an Indian company put it, he said, we're very clever here. We have what we call inside-out production. And I'll give you an example of inside-out production. We go to a Korean multinational whiteware company and flat screen company just outside Delhi. And inside, people are wearing white boiler suits. The place is humming. Production is terrific. And then we move outside. We get driven out through the perimeter gates. And what do you see? You see two guys with a bike, and on the bike is industrial coiled wire. And they were working from a slum. And so what you see is this inside-out production where you can, given certain conditions, good transport, communications, that kind of thing, you can set up and do high-quality production almost anywhere. And that is very scary in the terms of our own thinking, at least. So the second point, then, is this one about the equality of price, or the price and quality being equaled, and that you can produce very high-quality goods for very low prices. Because what that raises is the specter of high-skill, low-wage work. And that's precisely what you see in East Asia. We had a look at some of the comparisons between types of jobs, for example, in the computer industry, and in East Asia, in particular, for example, in India, you can get the same level of quality of worker for about 10% of the price of a Western worker, United States worker. So that's the second trend. Now there's a third trend. It gets worse. There's a third trend. And the third trend is what we call digital Taylorism. And what digital Taylorism is basically reducing the cost of brain power. Reducing the cost of brain power by converting it into computer algorithms. And what we're seeing is that that is moving up the value chain and the skill chain. And I'll just give you 2 points about this, which are important. The first is that the impetus for developing that kind of digital Taylorist sets of routines, where you take the knowledge in people's heads and put it into computer routines, just like under Taylorism, you took craft workers' knowledge and converted it into repetitive tasks. In that particular case, the impetus for that was offshoring, because you've got to standardize in order to offshore successfully. You've got to standardize your processes and your products to offshore successfully. And now I'll give you an example. Phil Brown and I went to a law firm in London, American multinational law firm, because we had assumed that the one place where you wouldn't get offshoring would be in law because of the details involved in that. And there's reference was made to this yesterday. So we go into this company and we say, before we start, we just want to make sure you don't offshore. And they looked at us naively, and that happened to us so often it was unbelievable. They looked at us as if we were really naive, and they said, yeah, we offshore. Go, well, where do you offshore to, and what do you offshore? So they took us through a case study of the Enron case, you know, that big case in America. And where they offshore to is the Philippines, because they've got a fantastic law school in Manila, and they teach there both American and British law. But that offshoring is now no longer necessary. And the reason for that is because they've now developed a set of computer algorithms that can do the work of discovery. It's the discovery work in law that was being offshored to the Philippines. They can do it now on a computer. And what that means is that they take through various forms of all the documents that are required for a case, emails, all the background documents, to see where they can make their case. And they tried this computer routine out in New York at one of the leading law firms there, and they made judgments as to how they would determine what was best, human judgment or the computer, and on their particular criteria, human judgment got it right 60% of the time, computer 90%. So what that's telling us is that there's movement up the skill and cognitive chain, as it were, in terms of what computer routines can do. So that is the third trend. Then there's a bit of good news, maybe. And that is that one of the things we walked into, the first executive that we interviewed was from a German multinational engineering company in southern Germany. We walked in, and on his bookshelf was one book, and it was called The War for Talent. So what is that? And of course, it's a famous book in management terms. Linda Grattan would know it very well. And what it is the assumption that there are only a few talented people that can actually progress and drive multinational companies. Now, for a moment, if you think about that, this is pretty bizarre. We've never had more graduates in the world than we have today. And at the very time when we've got all these people coming onto the market, and they should really be boosting productivity, boosting forms of economic development, what you see is an ideology coming on saying, well, no, there are all these graduates here, but actually there are only a few of them that we're interested in. And when I say few of them interested, I mean that really literally almost. That when we first started talking about this to the companies, they'd say, okay, in banking, this is in the UK, we look at this particular bank said, we look at Oxford, Cambridge, LSE, and Warwick. That's it. And this executive had been taught at the University of Bath and had a management degree from the University of Bath. And I said, what about Bath? And she said, no. It's out of our, it's just not where we're going. And that was repeated time and time again. There are differences because there's a different system in Germany for their higher education, of course. And there are differences in India. That wasn't always the rule. But certainly elsewhere, wherever he went, they recruited from a very narrow pool of graduates. And what, of course, that does is to intensify the competition to get into those universities that have that kind of reputation. And what you're seeing is a beauty contest between the MNCs, the multinational companies, and the universities. So the multinational companies say, we only recruit from the best universities in the world, and those best universities, in inverted commas, say, look, all our alumni go to fantastic jobs. So there's a very nice kind of beauty contest going on between the two of them there. So that's the war for talent. And those people that are recruited and regarded as talented, they sell their souls to the company, but they get huge rewards for it. So that is the other trend. Now, what that war for talent tells us is that what we're actually seeing is the division, the stratification of knowledge work. So the people at the top have the permission to think, but there are not many of them. Underneath that, you have the people that do some of the developing work. And beneath that, we have what we call, unkindly, the drones, but the people that are increasingly doing the digital Taylorist repetitive knowledge work. You need some basic qualifications to do that kind of work, clearly literacy, numeracy, IT skills. And after that, it's kind of more or less open season, but the work is routine. And so what we're seeing is a division now in terms of our occupational structure into these, we would suggest, into these different forms of knowledge work, and accordingly conflict. And the conflict is played out in education for kids and their parents driving to make sure that they can secure the best location in terms of universities around the world for them. So that then raises fundamental questions about, for example, graduates and graduate income. We would expect that graduate incomes in the West would decline, that there would be less graduate jobs, precisely because they will have been offshored, or taken over by machines. And if you want to ask me a question about the OECD and the PISA studies and all that stuff, education at the glance, which has just been published, I might have a comment on that later in questions if there are enough time. So given the situation we're in, is there a way out? Well, there's only one way out that Phil Brown and I can see, and it's this. We think that the solution, inverted commas here, to all this is that we develop industrial policies, and industrial policies which have a particular aim, and that is to raise the demand for graduate work, given the number of graduates we now have coming onto the market. Now, in saying that, we know that is very difficult. It takes experience, it takes time, and it takes a degree of agreement across political parties, because industrial strategies take a long time to develop, and people make mistakes. But when you look at the successful economies in the world, the East Asian economies, they've always been at the business of governing the market. They don't let the market govern them. They govern the market. They drive industrial development for their social development. That's the basic aim. If you look at Germany, I was referring to Germany yesterday, you know, we don't trust the market, we pick winners. And by goodness, they're doing it in a very sophisticated way. Now, I know that's difficult, but this country has got a tradition of tripartite collaboration. And we saw that yesterday with Jed Carney being here. So you've got to start in a way, for example, that the United Kingdom just doesn't have. America just doesn't have. But it also requires, and this is a point that I was listening yesterday and then this morning, you know, the importance of universities, the importance of employers. These people are all important, the graduates, the students, they're all important. But unless we have sharp policymakers, the people that are represented here who've put this conference on, for example, people like that, we will go nowhere. You have to have top-class policymakers, and that's one of the lessons that we learn. If you go to Singapore, the policymakers there earn more than people in private enterprise. They're terrifically well rewarded. Why, we asked? They said, well, we've got to be smarter than the smartest CEO of a top Fortune 100 company. Well, I'm not sure that smart and money go together, but nevertheless, that's their ideology, and that's what they're focusing on. So there are ways through this. They're not going to be easy, and they're going to take time. But if the belief is that the market now, in the terms that I've just discussed them, can solve these problems, it's not necessarily so. So I've tried to be as controversial as I can. I've tried to be as polemical as I can. I hope in many ways I'm wrong. However, we shall see. So I think I'll leave it at that, and thank you very much.
Well, congratulations, Hugh. It was terrific. However people respond to your points of view, I think a terrific point to really launch this morning. When you talk about the need for top-class policymakers, of course, the policymakers can only hand their policies to government. It's then left to the politicians to decide. You mentioned Singapore. The difference between Singapore and here, I can remember doing an interview with Lee Kuan Yew some years ago, and my question was something like, when are you going to become a real democracy? And he got very outraged and he said, we are a democracy. We have an opposition in the parliament. I said, yes, an opposition of one. He said, yes. And I said, and he's in jail. So, you know, that's one view of democracy, and we have another, and that comes with all its flaws. So you wouldn't hold your breath waiting for the courage of politicians, whether it's this country, whether it's the United States, whether it's Britain. Speak less of Europe, but that's the case, isn't it?
Yeah, it is a problem, and okay, I think there are two parts to this. We got asked to write a piece for a Tory party pamphlet. Came out of the blue, and I said to these people, do you know who I am? Do you understand what my views are? They went, yeah, no, it's fine. I said, look, well, I'm going to be kind of critical. And they go, okay, that's fine. And the point we made there was about the need for industrial policy, and pointed out that this cluster competition they have in Germany for their very high-level industrial policy is under Angela Merkel's government. That's a centre-right government. It's not a centre-left government.
Yeah.
So you can do it where you have a degree of agreement across parties. The problem in the English-speaking countries, or the Anglophone countries, is that they've relied so much on the market in the last 20 years that what they've got to do is come to terms with and then have the courage to move in a different kind of direction. I'm not super optimistic, but of all those countries, I'd say this was the one where there is enough kind of foundation where it might be possible.
You talked about Jacob's ladder and the angels, the sinning angels falling off. But isn't that not just the way of capitalism, but the way of human endeavour? There's always going to be someone falling off.
Yeah, absolutely, and you can't rule against that. But all you can do is say, I think, Kerry, that there are different forms of capitalism. We know that. And there's some that seem to be able to deal with the world better than others. And right now, I mean, in our sort of terms, the Northern Europeans seem to be doing it very well. And they have a different set of principles by which they operate. So, yep, you can't ensure that everyone's going to be successful, absolutely. But there are ways in which you can do better.
Now, when you talked about the narrowness of the recruitment process within multinationals, we talked yesterday, and I think you were here for the session, where they talked about the culture of work and the inclusiveness and the sharing of discourse and the sharing of information. Now, it seems to me there's a contradiction between the kind of elitist thinking that you're talking about and what we heard yesterday. Now, do you see a gap there between the talk and the reality as far as multinationals are concerned? And I know you can't automatically lump all corporations together.
Yep. I mean, what's interesting is that they all emphasize the importance of some kind of common culture. But having said that, it's very clear that their workforces are stratified. So one of the questions for us, and we asked them repeatedly, we said, okay, suppose you get someone, well, we asked it this way, we said, if you start at the bottom of the ladder, can you still work your way to the top in this company? And they'd scratch their heads and they'd go, oh yes, and then they'd pause for a minute, and they'd go, but it's increasingly difficult.
Yeah. Now, opportunity to ask questions from the audience. Yes, can we get the microphone here to the front? Michael Keating.
Thanks very much, Michael Keating. Look, I have to confess, I'm still a bit puzzled, but I do thank you for the provocation. My puzzlement is, first, all the data we have to date is that the premium for skills has risen over quite a long period and is still rising. As Robin Shreve put it only half an hour ago, he'd rather be a contracting neurosurgeon than a contracting cleaner. Our own scenarios, as we indicated yesterday, show that the main risk is a shortage of skills, not a surplus of skills. So sort of let's go back to basics. Really what we're talking about is whether the supply of skills will rise faster than the demand for skills. Obviously, if the supply rises faster than the demand, then there's a good chance over time that the premium for skills will come down. That'll be a reverse of our previous history. I guess where my question arises is really what's the future for the demand for skills? I think we can all accept that the supply of graduates, etc., is on the rise. I would add, however, that 195 million graduates in China is about a sixth of the population would be graduates. We're looking for something closer to 40% from memory, so it's not, it's not huge in that context. But on the demand for skills, what I've seen, the way I read the post-war history, is that developing countries, as they develop, including that process is higher education, is that those higher education graduates raise productivity, national output goes up relative to the number of people in the country, living standards as a result rise, and as a result of those increase in living standards, you get increased demand. And that demand of anything tends to be biased towards skills. So we take countries like Japan, which beginning in the 1950s probably had a lower income than India today. We see that now having a pattern of demand similar to ours, and I can repeat the examples, Taiwan, Korea, and so on. So to me, the critical factor is the increase in living standards and what that will mean. I'd be interested in your observations on that.
Thank you. That's a really good question, and it primes me for my crack at the OECD. Because the position you outlined yesterday and the OECD position are entirely consistent with one another.
Sorry, consistent or inconsistent?
Consistent.
Consistent, yeah.
So basically, this is the knowledge economy story, rather than knowledge capitalism, which is what we actually live in. So what's wrong with the knowledge economy story? Well, we're writing now the book on the death of human capital, which is basically the position that you've just outlined. So the better educated workers, the more productivity, the more rise in living standards. And at every point in that link, there are now fundamental problems and flaws. Now, I'm not sure whether they're necessarily the case in Australia. You have to look at each country separately. But certainly for the United States and Britain, it's absolutely clear that when you look and break down graduate income, so we're not talking now about the OECD averages, although they do break it down in terms of workers from 20 to 64 or something like that, which is useless. Gives us no idea of what the hell's actually going on from generation to generation. So when you break that down, what you see is that at the 90th percentile, so the top, from the 90% up, those workers young graduates moving into the labour market earn fabulous sums of money. And they continue to do it up to about 50, 55. But when you look at the rest, you get a totally different story. You get a little uptick for those at the median. And then it absolutely flatlines. We were even shocked by this, because human capital theory tells you that the more experience you have, the more skills that you gain on the job, the more you are productive, and therefore the more you gain in income. But that's not the case, because basically work is now being restructured, even for graduates, so that that's not the way they're rewarded. So that's a fundamental problem. Then there's the issue of productivity. And we had for the group yesterday, when we had the round table yesterday, we had a phone call a couple of months ago, and I was talking to Jed about the fact that, and I was asking her about Australia, and she gave you the answer yesterday, but that up until, in America, up until the mid-80s, productivity and wages went lockstep. And then after the mid-80s, it just goes like that. Productivity goes up, although it's not going up so fast now, and income goes flatlines. So there is a question there about the nature of productivity and the relationship to who wins in a society. It's okay to be productive and for incomes to flatline if there's some other mechanism of redistribution. But if there isn't, there's a fundamental problem. So I could go on for days, but I just want to indicate to you that in terms of that human capital theory that you've outlined, or basically referred to, and in terms of what the OECD produce, we just think it's fundamentally flawed, because they won't disaggregate the data and they won't ask the sorts of questions that we're asking. Ask those questions and you come up with rather different kinds of answers in many countries. It may be different in Australia. I hope it is.
Michael, I'd like to invite you to come back and continue this discourse. I'm afraid we don't have the time for that, but perhaps you'd like to afterwards, because this is clearly a really important, fundamental issue. You talked, Hugh, about the Dutch auction that the German company engaged in. One assumes that they wouldn't be so foolish as to simply go for the cheapest bidder, because that might, without taking account of the fact that the low bidder might also be offering lower quality. And that also leads to the question, if you're in a country like Australia, which has tried to fight above its weight, and we kind of pride ourselves on that, whether we're talking about sport or whatever, but where you've got these competing graduates coming through in China and other countries relative to Australia is part of the solution for Australia simply to produce a higher quality at whatever skill level you're talking about, a higher quality of skills, of those same skills, than in other countries, or is that just wishful thinking?
I think it's right, so long as you channel it into areas where you think you've got a competitive advantage. If you just generally try and up the skill levels, in the end, I mean, look, your graduates are very good. In the end, if you just keep on pushing and pushing and pushing, and I'm not saying that in primary and secondary school there aren't problems of literacy and numeracy, as there are in the UK and USA, so I'm not talking about that. But when you see what's happening, for example, in the UK, where teachers are getting hammered day in, day out because the standards aren't high enough, then you think, well, hang on a minute, this is about like a slave master on a boat, only the boat's sinking, and he's just whacking the people harder and harder to make them work better, and it's just the wrong model. So, in other words, when you think about these things, and they really do require, very careful thought, then the question is, what graduates, what quality, what economic activity? It's those sorts of questions.
We're right on time, but given that we started 10 minutes late, opportunity for one more question from the floor. Just behind you.
Hello, I'm Simon. I'm curious as to what you see the graduates' response to this might be. I mean, they're active players in this, and obviously being graduates, they could be quite intelligent and resourceful. What do you expect that their response is going to be that, the jobs within multinationals that they may traditionally have taken are now being offshored? I'd be kind of curious to see what's the next step.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I suppose the first point to make is that people don't go into higher education simply for economic returns. There are a whole bunch of very good reasons why they should be doing what they feel passionate about and interested in. And probably that's the first up thing. You should not see education as a means to another end. It can have that role, certainly. But nevertheless, I know that it costs graduates more and more money to engage in what they're interested in or passionate about. So clearly, if you have a highly educated citizenry, that in itself is important because that enables the sorts of debates we're having here. And that's also a crucial kind of question. However, having said all that, when you look at, I'm just about to publish in my journal a paper on the increasing numbers of graduates who are in low-paid work. And I don't know what happens under those circumstances, whether they turn it in on themselves and say, I'm actually not good enough, when in fact, objectively, the jobs aren't out there for them, or whether they do as in Britain in November a year ago, where students marched and vented, I think, a fear of the future. A fear of the future. There's a great quote from a French student leader who said, in 1968, they marched to change the world. We just want to keep it as it now is. I don't know. It's a huge problem.
Very quickly, Hugh, you touched very briefly yesterday on the kind of exam mentality. The children are jumping the exam hoops increasingly younger. And certainly in this country, we're in New South Wales, and having watched the final stages of my 6th child going through the HSC, let me tell you, there's an awful lot of box ticking goes on. There's a lot of exam hoops that get jumped, but it's not just the exam thing. It seems to me, it's very much about confining things to criteria, teaching to criteria, box ticking along the way. And it has struck me, rightly or wrongly, that there is a process here that risks not so much encouraging curiosity and creativity, but limiting it. And I just wonder very quickly if you can comment on that.
Yeah, Kerry, we come from the same generation. And there was a period of kind of an emphasis on creativity and a kind of progressive form of education. And I look at what's going on now and I'm horrified. There was a major policymaker in UK in 2005 produced a report on primary education. And I said to him, look, you think that all these kids are improving, but if they're just being taught to the test, what model of learning have you got? Is this a model of learning like swimming or riding a bike, that once you've got it, you always remember it? Or can these skills or understandings or learnings that these kids have got in terms of literacy and numeracy simply degrade and atrophy because they're not in a context in which they actually make use of them? And he couldn't answer that question.
Particularly when at the same time we're being told that the greatest period of creativity in any human life is in those maybe first 20 to 30 years. Anyway, look, we could go on forever. I find it fascinating. But Hugh, thank you very much for your contribution to this conference.
Thank you.
Thank you. There you go. Come over and get a box of chocolates.